It happened over dinner. Nothing dramatic. No shouting. No argument. Just a sentence said lightly, wrapped in a smile, delivered between bites of food. We were sitting around the dining table like we had done countless times before. Plates warm, conversation polite, the kind of ordinary evening that gives you no warning that something is about to change forever. My son was talking about work. My daughter-in-law laughed easily, comfortably, as if she already belonged to everything in that room. Then she leaned back in her chair, lifted her glass slightly, and said it. "This house should be ours now." She didn't pause. She didn't look at me for permission. She didn't frame it as a question. She said it the way people state facts. I felt my chest tighten, not because of anger, but because of disbelief. For a second, I honestly thought I had misheard her, that maybe she meant something else, that maybe this was some poorly worded joke. But she was smiling, confident, relaxed, as if the matter had already been settled. I looked at my son. He didn't react. No correction, no nervous laugh, no, "that's not what we meant." He kept eating. And in that silence, something shifted. It wasn't just the sentence that stunned me. It was the assumption behind it, the certainty, the way she spoke as if ownership was inevitable, as if time alone had transferred rights that were never offered. This wasn't a request. It was a claim. I had raised my son alone in this house. Every wall carried years of effort, of sacrifice, of nights spent calculating bills and mornings spent pretending I wasn't tired. This house wasn't just property. It was stability earned the hard way. And now my daughter-in-law was casually assigning it a new owner, herself. She noticed my stillness then. "Oh, I mean," she added quickly, laughing, "you know, eventually, we're family." Family. That word is often used to soften entitlement. She took another sip of her drink, clearly expecting the moment to pass, expecting me to nod, to smile, to accept the new reality she had just introduced. But I couldn't. Not because I wanted to argue, because I was suddenly aware of something far more unsettling. This wasn't the first boundary she had crossed. It was just the first one she crossed out loud. I thought back to the small comments I had brushed aside, the way she rearranged furniture without asking, the way she referred to "our future here" when talking to friends, the way she spoke about renovations as if they were already planned. I had told myself I was overthinking, that I didn't want to seem possessive, that it was normal for young couples to imagine, but imagining is different from declaring, and declaring, especially in front of witnesses, is a test. I glanced around the table. Everyone had heard her. No one challenged her. The room waited for my response. That was when I understood something painful. They weren't asking what I thought. They were waiting to see if I would resist. My daughter-in-law smiled again, but this time it was measured, watchful, as if she were gauging how far she could go. I realized then that this wasn't about the house. It was about control, about who had the right to decide, about who stayed silent, about who would step aside quietly to avoid discomfort. I took a slow breath. I didn't argue. I didn't correct her. I didn't defend myself. I simply said nothing. And my silence made the table uncomfortable in a way her comment never did. She shifted in her seat. My son finally looked up, sensing the tension but not naming it. Someone changed the subject. Dinner continued. But something had already ended. In that moment, I saw my place clearly, not as a mother being respected, but as an obstacle being managed. Someone whose assets were being discussed before her consent, whose future was being assumed without her voice. My daughter-in-law hadn't asked. She had claimed, and my son had let her. That was the shock, not the words themselves, but the realization that I was no longer being seen as the owner of my own life, just a temporary presence in a space others were already dividing. As I cleared the dishes later that night, I stood alone in the kitchen and looked around the house I had built, protected, and paid for. For the first time, it felt unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because I had. And somewhere between that dinner table and that quiet kitchen, I understood something with absolute clarity. This wasn't going to be a conversation. It was going to be a reckoning. I didn't answer her at the table, not because I didn't hear her, but because the sentence landed somewhere deeper than words. This house should be ours now. She said it casually, smiling, as if she were talking about rearranging furniture or choosing a paint color, as if ownership could be inherited by tone alone, as if time, effort, and sacrifice could be overwritten by marriage. The room stayed quiet. My son didn't laugh. He didn't correct her. He didn't look at me. That silence dragged me backward in time. Long before there were dinner tables filled with opinions, this house had been nothing but a distant idea, a goal I carried quietly while life kept demanding everything else first. I bought this house late, later than most, not because I didn't want one earlier, but because life kept asking me to wait. Wait until the bills were paid, wait until my child was safe, wait until the emergencies passed. There was always something more urgent than myself. I worked jobs that didn't come with pride, only necessity. Jobs where my name didn't matter, only my reliability. I saved slowly, deliberately, quietly. I learned to live without extras so I could afford permanence. This house wasn't an investment. It was a promise that one day I wouldn't have to ask permission to rest. When I finally signed the papers, my hands were shaking, not from excitement, but from exhaustion. Every payment that followed was a reminder of what it had cost me to get there. No one helped. No one co-signed. No one rescued me when money was tight. I didn't complain. I adjusted. That's what you do when you don't have a safety net. The house became my anchor. Not because it was large or impressive, but because it was paid for. Because it was quiet. Because it belonged to me in a way nothing else ever had. It was where I exhaled. I raised my son here after the hardest years were already behind me. The walls didn't judge when I came home tired. The floors didn't ask questions when I walked them at night, counting expenses in my head. This house held my silence. It held my resilience. And now, sitting at that table, listening to my daughter-in-law speak as if it were already hers, I realized something that made my chest tighten. She didn't see the house. She saw the result. She saw stability without knowing what instability had shaped it. She didn't see the years of saying no to myself. She didn't see the fear of missing one payment. She didn't see the nights I lay awake wondering if I could afford to grow old at all. She only saw an asset, and assets in her mind were meant to be shared, claimed, absorbed into the next generation without question. What hurt wasn't the assumption. It was the entitlement wrapped in ease, because no one who builds something from nothing ever treats it lightly. I looked around the room and realized I was the only one who understood what this house truly meant. To them, it was a setting, a backdrop, a place where meals happened and conversations unfolded. To me, it was survival made solid, and in that moment, I understood the danger, not of losing a building, but of being slowly erased from the story of how it came to exist. That house was never just a house to me. It wasn't a symbol. It wasn't an asset. It wasn't something I planned to pass around or negotiate over dinner. It was the place I built so I could grow old in peace. I bought it long before my son met his wife, long before family gatherings filled the dining room, long before anyone spoke the word ours with such confidence. Back then, it was just me, a set of keys that felt too heavy in my hand, and the quiet certainty that I was finally doing something only for myself. I worked for years to afford it. Extra hours, missed holidays, jobs I stayed in longer than I should have because stability mattered more than pride. I paid the mortgage month by month, watching the balance shrink slowly, patiently, like a promise being kept one payment at a time. No one helped me buy that house. No one co-signed. No one took the risk with me. When the last payment cleared, I didn't throw a party. I didn't tell many people. I stood alone in the living room, looked around, and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Safety. That house became my quiet reward for a life of responsibility. Every corner carried intention. The kitchen where I cooked meals that stretched across several days. The bedroom where I slept without worrying if someone else needed something from me. The small space by the window where I drank my coffee in the morning, letting the silence settle before the day began. It was modest, but it was mine. When my son was younger, that house was his anchor. It was where he came home after school, where he studied, where he complained, where he dreamed. I never reminded him of that. I never kept score. I assumed that love, once given, didn't need to be audited. As he grew older, I kept the house the same, not because I was stuck in the past, but because it represented continuity. No matter how chaotic life became, that place stayed steady. I told myself it would be where I spent my later years, quietly, independently, without burdening anyone. That was the plan. When my son married, I welcomed his wife into that space without hesitation. I cooked for her. I made room for her preferences. I adjusted routines I'd held for decades so she would feel comfortable. I never imagined comfort would be mistaken for surrender. I never imagined generosity would be confused with ownership. At first, it was small things, suggestions about furniture, comments about how things could be rearranged, light jokes about our future here, said with a laugh that made it seem harmless. I brushed it off. People say things without thinking, I told myself. New marriages come with excitement. I didn't want to be the kind of mother who guards every boundary like a battlefield, but deep down, something felt off. Not because she was rude, but because she spoke as if the house had already shifted hands. I didn't correct her. I didn't want to embarrass anyone. I didn't want to create tension over words that could still be dismissed as careless. So I stayed quiet. I kept hosting, I kept sharing, I kept pretending that nothing fundamental was being misunderstood. But the truth was simple. That house wasn't a gift. It wasn't a shared project. It wasn't something earned through marriage. It was the result of my life's work. And without realizing it yet, I was about to learn how easily people claim what they never built. The change didn't happen overnight. That's what made it dangerous. At first, it sounded harmless, casual, even affectionate. My daughter-in-law began using a new word more often, we. We should move this sofa. We don't really need this cabinet here. We'll make the house feel more modern. She never asked if I agreed. She spoke as if agreement had already been granted. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was just how young couples talked, that I shouldn't be sensitive. After all, they were family now. Families shared space. Families adjusted. But something in her tone unsettled me. It wasn't excitement. It was ownership. One afternoon, I came home to find the living room rearranged. Furniture I had chosen years ago, pieces that carried memories, had been pushed aside. A chair I always sat in was gone, replaced by something sleeker, newer, unfamiliar. "It looks better this way," she said lightly when she saw me standing there. More open. More us. I nodded, not because I agreed, but because I didn't yet understand what was happening. Over the next weeks, the language continued to shift. She talked about our routines, our plans, our space. She invited people over without checking with me first. When I hesitated, she laughed and said, "You don't have to ask me, I'm family." That was when I realized something crucial. She wasn't asking, she was informing. My son noticed none of this, or pretended not to. When I brought it up gently, he smiled in that distracted way he had learned somewhere along the line. "She doesn't mean anything by it, Mom," he said. "She's just trying to make the place feel like home." The place. Not your home, not my home, just the place. That word landed heavier than it should have. I began to feel like a guest in rooms I had paid for, maintained, protected for decades. Conversations paused when I entered. Plans were discussed around me, not with me. Decisions were made before I knew they existed. I was still living there. But something had shifted. I started noticing small exclusions. A shelf cleared without asking. A cupboard reorganized so my things no longer fit. Photos quietly moved from prominent spaces to side tables, then to drawers. Nothing openly hostile. Nothing I could point to and say, "This is wrong." That's how erasure works. It's polite, it's gradual, and it makes you question your own perception. I told myself not to overreact. I reminded myself how much I loved my son, how much I wanted peace, how many times in my life I had adapted so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable, but deep down a warning was forming. This wasn't about decorating, it was about boundaries, and they were disappearing. One evening I overheard her on the phone. She was laughing, relaxed, confident. "Yeah," she said, "we're finally settling in. It really feels like our house now." I stood still in the hallway, my heart pounding harder than it should have. Our house. She said it so easily, as if years of work, sacrifice, and security could be overwritten by marriage alone, as if my presence was temporary, as if I was the one who would eventually need permission to stay. That was the moment I became alert. Not angry, not confrontational, alert. Because when someone starts rewriting reality with language, they are preparing to rewrite it with action. And I knew then, this wasn't about sharing a home. It was about taking one. At first, it didn't feel like an invasion. It felt like help. My daughter-in-law started with small changes, so small they almost felt polite. She moved a vase from the hallway to the living room, replaced a framed photo with something more modern, rearranged the cushions on the couch because, as she said, "This layout feels more open." She smiled when she said it. That's how these things begin, not with conflict, with comfort. I watched from the doorway as she walked through the house with growing familiarity, opening cabinets without asking, commenting on storage space, mentioning what we could do differently. The word appeared casually at first. "We should paint this wall. We could turn this room into something more useful. We don't really need this anymore." Each sentence landed softly, but together they formed a pattern, a claim disguised as inclusion. My son didn't notice. Or maybe he noticed and chose not to see it. He laughed along, nodded when she spoke, followed her lead when she moved things around. When I looked at him, he avoided my eyes, not guiltily, just distracted, as if this was all too ordinary to question. That hurt more than her words ever could, because silence is how boundaries disappear. Soon, changes moved beyond objects. She began talking about routines, what time we should eat, how we could host holidays, which rooms made sense for guests and which didn't. She spoke with confidence, the kind that comes from believing permission is unnecessary, and the more she spoke, the more invisible I felt. I was still living there, but I was no longer at home. I tried to ground myself in logic, told myself this was temporary, that she was just enthusiastic, that couples often behaved this way when they were settling in. I reminded myself that family required flexibility, that harmony sometimes meant letting small things go. But these weren't small things. They were decisions, and none of them included me. One afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find the living room rearranged entirely. The chair I always sat in moved to the corner, a bookshelf relocated, my things placed neatly in a box by the wall. "Just organizing," she said brightly when she saw my expression. "It makes more sense this way." I stood there, keys still in my hand, feeling like a guest who had overstayed her welcome without realizing it. I didn't argue. I asked a simple question. "Why didn't you ask me first?" She laughed, light, dismissive. "Oh, I didn't think you'd mind." That sentence stayed with me, because it wasn't about my comfort. It was about her assumption that my consent was optional. From that day on, the language changed. She stopped saying your house. She said the house. Then she stopped saying that too. She started saying our place. And each time she did, something inside me tightened. I noticed how she spoke to others when I wasn't directly part of the conversation, how she referred to plans she hadn't discussed with me, how she introduced the space as if it already belonged to her future, not my present. And slowly, unmistakably, I realized what was happening. This wasn't about sharing, it was about replacing. I wasn't being pushed out violently, I was being erased politely. And the most unsettling part? Everyone else seemed comfortable with it. My son smiled when she talked about renovations. He agreed when she suggested updates. He stood beside her when guests complimented the changes. Not once did he say, "This is my mother's home." Not once did he say, We should talk to her first." That silence was louder than any argument. I began to understand that boundaries aren't always crossed by force. Sometimes they're dissolved by familiarity, by repetition, by the quiet confidence of someone who believes they already belong. And as I stood in that living room, my living room, I felt the ground shift beneath me. Not suddenly, gradually, like a house settling into a shape that no longer had space for me. I didn't notice his silence at first, because it didn't arrive as cruelty. It arrived as calm, as patience, as the kind of stillness people mistake for maturity. He sat at the table while his wife spoke about the house as if it were already theirs, and he smiled politely, nodded occasionally, avoided my eyes. Not once did he interrupt her. Not once did he say my name. That was when I realized something far more painful than open betrayal. My son had chosen comfort over courage. He wasn't attacking me. He was simply stepping aside and letting it happen. At first, I told myself he was just surprised, that maybe he didn't know how to respond in the moment, that perhaps he would speak to her later, privately, and draw a line where one needed to exist. I held on to that hope longer than I should have, because mothers are trained to protect the image of their children even when reality contradicts it. But days passed, then weeks, and nothing changed. The language in the house shifted. Your house quietly became our place. Decisions were discussed without me, then announced to me, then no longer explained at all. And through it all, my son stayed silent. His silence was careful, strategic. He never agreed with her out loud, but he never disagreed either. When she rearranged the furniture, he said nothing. When she talked about future renovations, he laughed nervously and changed the subject. When I tried to speak, to express discomfort, he offered vague reassurances that solved nothing. "She doesn't mean it that way." "You're overthinking. Let's not turn this into a problem." Each sentence was smooth, reasonable, and deeply dismissive. He wasn't cruel enough to hurt me directly. He was gentle enough to let me hurt alone. That was when the illusion shattered. I had raised my son to be kind, responsible, and respectful. I believed those qualities would extend to how he treated me. What I didn't anticipate was that kindness without backbone becomes avoidance, and responsibility without loyalty becomes convenience. He didn't defend me because defending me would have required discomfort. It would have required him to disappoint his wife, to challenge her sense of entitlement, to acknowledge that a line had been crossed. And he wasn't willing to do that. Peace for him mattered more than fairness. Harmony mattered more than truth. I watched him slowly reposition himself, not physically, but emotionally. He stood closer to her in conversations. He echoed her language without fully committing to it. He became a bridge only in appearance, while quietly shifting his weight to her side. I was still there, still present, still contributing, but no longer centered. I had become something that needed to be managed, not protected, something inconvenient, not foundational. And the most painful part wasn't that my daughter-in-law claimed space that wasn't hers. It was that my son allowed it, because allowing it cost him nothing. One evening, after another dinner where I felt invisible in my own home, I asked him directly if he thought what was happening was fair. He didn't answer right away. He looked tired, uncomfortable, trapped between two worlds he didn't know how to reconcile. Then he said something that changed everything. "I just don't want conflict," he told me quietly. Not, "I don't agree with her," not, "I'll talk to her." Just that. I don't want conflict. In that moment, I understood exactly where I stood. My dignity was negotiable, my security was optional, my feelings were secondary to his desire for an easy life. I didn't argue, I didn't raise my voice, I simply nodded, because there is a specific kind of heartbreak that doesn't need reaction. It arrives fully formed, complete, undeniable. The realization that the child you raised will not stand between you and harm if standing requires sacrifice. That silence, chosen repeatedly, is not neutrality. It is alignment. And my son had made his choice without ever saying it out loud. What hurt most wasn't what my daughter-in-law said. It was what my son didn't say. Silence has a sound when it comes from someone you raised. It's heavy. It lingers. It echoes long after the moment has passed. I watched him sit there, nodding slightly, eyes lowered, as if neutrality were a virtue instead of a choice. He didn't agree with her words, but he didn't challenge them either. And in that moment, I understood something I had been avoiding for a long time. His peace mattered more to him than my dignity. Later that night, I waited for him to come to me. I told myself he just needed time, that surely he would knock on my door, sit across from me, and say something, anything, to acknowledge what had happened. But the knock never came. The hallway stayed quiet. His door stayed closed. And with every passing minute, the truth became harder to ignore. He wasn't confused. He wasn't unaware. He had made a calculation, and the result didn't include me. The next morning, I tried to speak to him directly, not to accuse, not to argue, just to understand. I asked him why he hadn't said anything. He sighed, rubbed his face, and told me he didn't want to make things worse. He said it was just a comment, that I was reading too much into it, that everyone needed time to adjust. Adjust. As if my home were a shared inconvenience instead of the place I had built with my own hands. As if respect were optional until everyone felt comfortable. That was when disappointment settled into something colder. I realized he wasn't choosing her over me. He was choosing avoidance over responsibility. He wanted harmony, even if it was artificial, even if it came at my expense. He wanted the house quiet, the dinners pleasant, the tension invisible. And the easiest way to achieve that was to let me absorb the discomfort silently, the way I always had. I began to see the pattern clearly. Every time his wife pushed a boundary, he reframed it as harmless. Every time I hesitated, he asked me to be patient. Every time I felt erased, he reminded me how hard marriage was. My feelings became obstacles to manage rather than signals to respect. I wasn't his mother in those moments. I was a variable disrupting the equation of his new life. What hurt most was remembering how fiercely I had protected him when he was younger. How many times I had spoken up when something wasn't right, even when it was uncomfortable, even when it made me the bad guy. I had believed I was teaching him courage. Instead, somewhere along the way, he learned that silence was safer than loyalty. That night, lying awake in my own house, I finally understood that the betrayal wasn't sudden. It had been unfolding quietly, decision by decision, moment by moment. This was simply the first time it was impossible to ignore. He didn't defend me because defending me required conflict, and conflict threatened the fragile peace he was trying to maintain. I stopped asking him to choose, not because the choice no longer mattered, but because I already had my answer. Silence, I learned, is a position, avoidance is alignment, and when someone repeatedly refuses to protect you, they are telling you exactly where you stand. The realization didn't make me angry, it made me tired. Tired of explaining why I deserved respect in my own home, tired of shrinking to keep the atmosphere calm, tired of being patient while my place in my own life slowly disappeared. I saw then that if I stayed silent too, the erasure would be complete, and if I spoke, nothing would change except the tension he feared so much. That was the moment my grief turned into clarity. I didn't lose my son that day. I saw him clearly for the first time, and once you see something clearly, you can no longer pretend it's something else. I didn't confront him again. I didn't demand apologies or promises. I simply stopped waiting for him to become someone he wasn't ready to be. And in that quiet acceptance, something shifted. I began to understand that protecting myself no longer meant hoping he would change. It meant preparing myself to act, even if he never did. I didn't confront anyone, not my daughter-in-law, not my son, not even myself. I did something far more dangerous to people who were used to my silence. I became quiet in a different way, a deliberate way. The kind of quiet that doesn't wait for permission or approval. The kind that prepares. That night, after everyone had gone to bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was silent in the way it only is when you live with people who don't notice you anymore. The same walls I had paid for, the same roof I had worked decades to secure. And suddenly I realized something with painful clarity. This wasn't just about words spoken at dinner. This was about territory, ownership, assumptions. This house should be ours now. She hadn't asked. She had claimed, and claims, I knew, don't come from nowhere. They grow quietly, fed by silence, by comfort, by people who don't push back. I had been too generous for too long, too accommodating, too willing to keep peace by shrinking myself. But that night, I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I didn't replay the scene in my head looking for better responses. I opened a folder. Inside were documents I hadn't looked at in years, property papers, old contracts, a copy of the deed with my name printed clearly across the top. I traced the letters with my finger, not for reassurance, but for grounding. This house was mine, legally, completely. No shared ownership, no ambiguity, no loophole that kindness could accidentally create. Still, I didn't stop there. Because quiet justice isn't about feeling safe, it's about being prepared. Over the next few days, I moved carefully, casually, as if nothing had changed. I cooked meals. I smiled when spoken to. I nodded during conversations that no longer included me. But internally, something had shifted. I wasn't listening emotionally anymore. I was listening strategically. I scheduled an appointment with a legal advisor, not to threaten anyone, not to confront, just to understand, to confirm, to close doors that had been left open out of trust. The conversation was calm, professional, almost boring. "Yes," he said, "the house is solely yours." "No," he added, "no one else has any legal claim unless you grant it." "And yes," he finished, "verbal assumptions mean nothing without paperwork." That was when the weight lifted, not emotionally but mentally. Clarity has that effect. It doesn't comfort you, it steadies you. I asked about wills, about power of attorney, about what would happen if I became ill, about what would happen if I didn't. Not because I was afraid of dying, but because I was done being erased while alive. Every answer reinforced the same truth. I had more control than I had ever used. And my mistake hadn't been ignorance, it had been restraint. I didn't go home angry, I went home awake. From that moment on, I stopped reacting. I started observing patterns. How my daughter-in-law spoke when she thought I wasn't listening, how she referred to the house as we instead of you, how my son avoided any sentence that required choosing between his wife's comfort and my dignity. Their behavior hadn't changed, only my awareness had, and awareness is dangerous to people who rely on your blindness. I didn't announce boundaries. I didn't explain intentions. I simply began closing doors quietly, one by one, updating documents, reassigning responsibilities, removing assumptions that had never been discussed but had somehow become accepted. No one noticed at first. That's the thing about preparation. It doesn't draw attention until it's too late to stop it. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting a dramatic reveal. I was protecting the one thing that had always been treated as negotiable, my place. This house was never just a building. It was the proof of a lifetime of work, of survival, of independence earned the hard way, and I had no intention of letting it become a bargaining chip in someone else's marriage. So I stayed quiet, not weak, strategic, and that was the moment the balance began to shift, long before anyone realized the game had changed. Once I began preparing instead of reacting, everything inside me settled. Fear needs chaos to survive. And for the first time in months, my life was no longer chaotic. I stopped listening for footsteps in my own house. I stopped reading tone into casual remarks. I stopped wondering what they were planning next. When you understand the law, speculation loses its power. I learned exactly what ownership meant and what it didn't. The house was mine, fully, legally, paid for, documented, protected. No verbal claim, no marital assumption, no casual "we" spoken over dinner could change that. I reviewed every document slowly, line by line, not because I was nervous, but because I was calm. Calm enough to think clearly, calm enough to see how easily I could have lost everything if I had stayed emotional instead of informed. I realized how often women like me are expected to rely on trust instead of structure, on love instead of documentation, on family instead of law. That realization hardened something in me, not into bitterness, but into resolve. I updated my will. Quietly, I clarified beneficiaries. Precisely. I added protections I had never thought I would need from the very people I once believed would protect me. I didn't do this out of spite. I did it out of respect for the life I had built. The woman who bought this house decades ago had worked too hard to let sentiment erase her rights. She had survived layoffs, illness, loneliness, and years of carrying responsibility alone. She deserved better than to be slowly displaced by entitlement disguised as family. As I organized the paperwork, something unexpected happened. I stopped feeling old. I stopped feeling fragile. I felt competent. Power doesn't always arrive as strength. Sometimes it arrives as clarity. I understood now that my daughter-in-law's confidence hadn't come from courage. It had come from assumption. And assumptions collapse the moment they're tested. I didn't warn her. I didn't confront my son. Preparation doesn't announce itself. It waits. And in that waiting, I began to observe them differently. The way my daughter-in-law spoke about the house, as if it were already decided. The way my son avoided conversations that required him to choose. The way both of them relied on my silence as proof of consent. They didn't realize silence can also be strategy. I moved through the house differently after that. Slower, more deliberate, like someone who knew exactly where the walls stood and why they mattered. I cleaned out drawers not to make space for them, but to reclaim space for myself. I removed things I no longer needed, not objects, expectations. That night, I slept better than I had in weeks, not because anything had changed yet, but because I was ready. Ready to stop being surprised, ready to stop being pushed, ready to stop negotiating what was never theirs to take. I didn't know how the confrontation would come, or when. I only knew one thing. When it did, I would not be scrambling. I would not be explaining. I would not be defending myself emotionally. I would be standing on paper, on law, on truth, and that kind of ground doesn't shift. For the first time since that dinner, the moment when the word ours cut deeper than any insult, I felt something close to relief, not because the danger was gone, but because I was no longer unprepared. I had stopped reacting, and I had started protecting myself. I didn't announce the change. That was the first thing they failed to understand. There was no argument, no confrontation, no dramatic line in the sand. I didn't say, "This stops now." I didn't threaten, explain, or defend myself. I simply adjusted my behavior in ways so subtle they didn't notice at first. And that was the point. I stopped paying attention to what they assumed was shared. The house was still mine. It always had been. But somewhere along the way, it had started to feel like a communal resource, something everyone could use, arrange, and plan around without asking. I had allowed that illusion to grow because I believed generosity would be met with respect. I was wrong. So I stopped feeding the illusion. I stopped covering small expenses that quietly benefited them. I stopped allowing decisions about the house to be made in conversations I wasn't part of. I stopped nodding when my daughter-in-law referred to rooms as ours or schedules as what works for all of us. I didn't correct her. I simply didn't comply. At first, she didn't notice. Privilege rarely notices itself. When access has always been automatic, its absence feels like a glitch, not a boundary. She assumed things would continue as they always had, because why wouldn't they? But then the glitches added up. A request met with silence, a plan delayed, a suggestion unanswered, small things, manageable things, until they weren't. She began to hesitate before speaking. I could hear it in her voice, the way certainty softened into testing. Statements became questions, confidence became careful phrasing. Would it be okay if we... Do you mind if... Those words had never mattered to her before. I watched her adjust in real time, trying to locate the invisible line she had crossed without realizing it existed. She wasn't angry yet. She was confused. Confusion is the first crack in entitlement. My son noticed next. He didn't confront me. He never did. Instead, he tried to smooth things over the way he always had, by pretending nothing was wrong. He spoke about stress, about how everyone was tired, about how marriage came with adjustments. He spoke around the issue. Avoidance had always been his strategy. If he didn't name the problem, maybe it would resolve itself. It didn't. Because for the first time, I wasn't absorbing the tension for him. I didn't offer reassurance. I didn't rush to make things easier. I let discomfort sit where it belonged, and discomfort has a way of exposing truth. My daughter-in-law grew restless. She checked accounts. She asked questions that didn't quite make sense yet. She noticed that the house, my house, was no longer being treated like an extension of her future. Her tone shifted. There was less confidence, more calculation. She wasn't afraid of me. She was afraid of losing access. That distinction mattered. One evening, she made an offhand comment at dinner about tightening things up financially, watching my face closely as she spoke. I kept eating. I didn't react. I didn't reassure her. Silence does more than anger ever could, because anger invites defense. Silence invites fear. She tried again a few days later, suggesting long-term plans for the house, renovations, adjustments, ideas framed as inevitabilities. I looked at her calmly and said nothing. Not yes, not no, nothing. That was when it started to sink in. The house wasn't slipping into her control. It was slipping out of her imagination. I wasn't taking anything away. I wasn't punishing her. I wasn't being cruel. I was simply reclaiming what had always been mine, authority over my own life, my own property, my own boundaries. And the more I withdrew, the clearer it became how much they had relied on my quiet permission. That realization unsettled them, because permission, once revoked, forces people to confront something uncomfortable: ownership. And for the first time since my daughter-in-law had smiled across the dinner table and said, "This house should be ours now," she understood something she had never considered. It never was. The shift became impossible to ignore once nothing was being handed over anymore. I didn't announce new rules or draw lines on the floor. I didn't say, "This is mine," or "You can't do that." I simply stopped behaving as if the house belonged to anyone but me, and that alone changed everything. Access that once felt automatic suddenly required asking. Decisions that used to be made casually now stalled, waiting for approval that never came. The house didn't change, but the atmosphere did. It no longer adjusted itself around their comfort. It stood still. My daughter-in-law noticed first. She started hesitating before rearranging things, before inviting people over, before talking about we and us the way she used to. Her confidence cracked in small ways. She asked questions she never asked before. She waited for reactions that didn't come. The unspoken assumption that this home was a shared resource quietly dissolved, and without that assumption, her certainty had nowhere to stand. She tested it carefully. A comment about renovations, a suggestion about future plans, a casual remark about what made sense for the family. I didn't argue, I didn't correct her, I didn't push back. I simply responded as the homeowner, not the background presence. Neutral, calm, final. The kind of tone that doesn't invite discussion because it isn't emotional. It's factual. That was when anxiety replaced entitlement. She began watching me more closely, reading my reactions, measuring her words. She stopped moving freely through the space and started navigating it. And navigation is exhausting when you thought you owned the map. My son felt it too, but he struggled to name it. He sensed that something essential had changed but didn't know how to address it without admitting what he had allowed to happen. He avoided direct conversations, hoping things would settle on their own. But they didn't. Because nothing settles once power dynamics are exposed. The house stopped functioning as their safety net. It stopped being the place where assumptions lived. It became what it had always legally been, but never socially enforced: mine. And when that reality surfaced, everything built on entitlement began to shake. My daughter-in-law started worrying out loud about stability, about what-ifs, about how things might look going forward. Her tone softened, then sharpened, then softened again. She wasn't angry, she was afraid. afraid of losing access she had never earned but had already planned her future around. I didn't take anything away. I didn't evict. I didn't threaten. I didn't change locks or make scenes. I just stopped giving permission where permission had never been required before, and in doing so, I let the truth breathe. The truth was simple. Generosity had been mistaken for surrender. Once that mistake was corrected, their world felt less predictable. My son tried to smooth things over. He spoke about compromise, about keeping the peace, about how families should function. But his words came without action, and without action, they were weightless. He wanted balance without conflict, but balance requires acknowledgement, and he still wasn't ready for that. What unsettled them most wasn't what I did. It was what I didn't do. I didn't rush to reassure. I didn't fill the silence. I didn't make things easier. I allowed inconvenience to exist, and inconvenience reveals dependence faster than any argument ever could. They began realizing how much of their comfort had been built on something they didn't own, didn't respect, and didn't protect. And once that realization settled in, panic followed. Quiet panic. Polite panic. The kind that shows up as excessive courtesy and forced calm. I watched it all without satisfaction, because this wasn't about teaching lessons. It was about reclaiming space, about refusing to be slowly erased in my own home under the disguise of family unity. The house felt different to me too, lighter, clearer. It no longer carried tension that wasn't mine. I walked through rooms without feeling watched. I sat in silence without feeling evaluated. The walls felt like boundaries again, not obligations. This was not revenge. Revenge requires anger. This required clarity. I had stopped reacting. I had stopped accommodating. I had stopped pretending that love meant surrender. And in that stillness, the truth did the rest. They hadn't lost the house. They had lost the illusion that it was ever theirs. The collapse didn't begin with shouting. It began with confusion, the kind that creeps in slowly when people realize the rules they were playing by no longer apply. My daughter-in-law was the first to sense it. The house no longer felt like something she could plan around, decorate around, or speak about as if it were already hers. Small things changed. She stopped inviting people over without asking. She stopped saying, "We should do this," and started saying, "Do you mind if we—" The certainty she once wore so comfortably slipped, replaced by a tight politeness that felt unfamiliar on her. My son noticed next, though he didn't name it right away. He just felt pressure where there used to be ease. Bills that he assumed were handled suddenly weren't. Conversations that once ended with my quiet approval now ended unresolved. He tried to smooth things over the way he always had, with vague reassurances and avoidance, but this time it didn't work. There was nothing left to smooth. I wasn't reacting. I wasn't arguing. I was simply no longer filling the gaps. That's when her parents entered the picture. Not loudly at first, just questions. Casual, careful questions. Who actually owned the house? What arrangements had been made? What did I intend to do going forward? They framed it as concern, as family coordination, as adults trying to avoid misunderstandings. But beneath every question was the same assumption, that this was still negotiable. It wasn't. The tension escalated quickly once they realized I wasn't engaging the way I used to. Calls went unanswered longer than expected. Messages were returned briefly, without warmth, without explanation. The absence of reassurance created panic faster than any argument could have, because arguments suggest you still care enough to fight. Silence suggests something far worse. My daughter-in-law finally broke, not with anger, not with insults, but with fear. She asked to talk, not demanded, asked. Her tone was careful, almost rehearsed. She wanted to clear things up, to make sure everyone was on the same page. She spoke as if this were a misunderstanding that could be corrected with the right conversation. I listened. I always listened, but I didn't agree. That refusal, quiet, calm, final, unraveled everything. Her parents pushed harder after that. They suggested compromise. They hinted at arrangements, shared ownership, future expectations. They spoke in the language of entitlement disguised as practicality. They believed the situation could be managed, adjusted, salvaged. They still thought this was about discussion. What they didn't understand was that the collapse had already happened. Not because I took something away, but because I stopped pretending. I stopped allowing my home to be treated like a shared resource. I stopped letting my silence be interpreted as consent. I stopped cushioning their assumptions. The house, once spoken about so casually as ours, suddenly became a problem, a source of anxiety, a question mark. My daughter-in-law grew tense, defensive, then desperate. She watched plans unravel and didn't know how to put them back together because the foundation she thought she had was never hers to begin with. Arguments followed, not with me, but among them. Blame shifted quickly. Her parents blamed her for speaking too soon. She blamed my son for not securing things earlier. My son blamed stress, timing, misunderstanding. Everyone searched for someone else to hold responsible because none of them wanted to face the truth. They had mistaken access for ownership, and ownership for entitlement. The panic wasn't about losing me, it was about losing control, about realizing that what they thought was guaranteed had never been promised, that the house they planned around, the future they assumed, the security they leaned on, none of it belonged to them. And for the first time, they could feel it slipping. That was when they stopped pretending it was about family and started calling it a problem that needed to be solved. The word talk came back again and again, always framed as reasonable, always urgent. They didn't ask how I felt, they asked when we could meet. They didn't apologize for crossing boundaries, they wanted to renegotiate them. My daughter-in-law's tone shifted overnight, from confident to careful, from demanding to pleading. She no longer spoke about what made sense for everyone. She spoke about stress, pressure, and how difficult things had suddenly become. Her parents stepped in quickly, calling on my son, calling on me, trying to restore order the only way they knew how, by applying pressure where entitlement had failed. They suggested compromises, temporary arrangements, shared understanding. Words like fair, reasonable, and practical were repeated as if ownership could be softened by language. They spoke as though the house had already been divided in their minds, and all that remained was to formalize it. That was the moment everything became visible. The concern was never about harmony, it was about access. When access felt threatened, panic followed. My son sat across from me, exhausted, caught between two sides and still trying to avoid choosing either. He said they were worried. He said they felt blindsided. He said maybe we could all meet together and clear the air. He never said they were wrong. He never said the house was mine. He spoke as if neutrality was the same as fairness, as if silence could still protect him. I listened without interrupting, and when he finished, I told him something he didn't expect. "This isn't a misunderstanding," I said calmly. "It's a correction." That word unsettled him. Correction meant something had been wrong for a long time. Correction meant the story they had been telling themselves no longer worked. He asked what I wanted. That question revealed everything. They still believed this was a negotiation, that something could be offered to restore the old arrangement. I told him the truth, slowly and clearly. I'm not asking for anything. I'm reclaiming what was always mine. When my daughter-in-law finally spoke to me directly, her fear was no longer disguised. She asked if there was another option, another way forward that didn't involve such finality. She said she never meant to hurt me. She said she thought we were all on the same page. I looked at her and realized she truly believed that claiming my home had been a reasonable assumption. That belief hadn't come from malice. It had come from entitlement that had never been challenged. They thought it was ours until it wasn't. The sentence landed heavily between us, not as an accusation, but as a fact. The room went quiet. There was nothing left to argue against. She tried one last approach, softer this time, almost respectful. She asked if I was doing this to punish them. I shook my head. "I didn't take anything away," I said. "I just stopped giving." That was the moment the collapse became complete. Without my consent, without my quiet cooperation, nothing moved forward. Plans unraveled, expectations collapsed under their own weight. The house was no longer a shared idea, no longer a future asset, no longer a bargaining chip. It was simply my home again. The panic they felt wasn't about losing me. It was about losing control over something they had never owned. Their anger surfaced briefly, sharp and defensive, before giving way to fear. Fear has a way of exposing motives that politeness hides. They wanted security without responsibility, stability without respect. When those things disappeared, so did the performance of unity. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't threaten. I didn't explain myself again. I simply stayed firm. The collapse wasn't dramatic. It was structural. A system built on assumption can't survive clarity, and once clarity enters the room, there is no going back to pretending nothing changed. By the end, they weren't asking for ownership anymore. They were asking for reassurance. And that was something I could no longer give. Because reassurance, when given too freely, becomes permission. And permission was what had allowed everything to go this far in the first place. The house stood exactly where it always had. Solid. Unmoved. The only thing that had collapsed was the illusion that it belonged to anyone else. I didn't argue with her. I didn't confront my son. And I didn't demand apologies that would only arrive out of fear. I did something far quieter and far more permanent. I protected myself. For the first time since she said the house should be ours, I stopped reacting emotionally and started acting deliberately. I sat alone at the dining table long after everyone had gone to bed, the same table where that sentence had been spoken so casually, and I realized something that changed everything. This house was not a symbol of family. It was a legal reality. And legal realities don't care about feelings, entitlement, or silence. The next morning, I gathered every document I had ever stored away and tried not to think about how long it had taken me to finally do this. The deed. The mortgage papers stamped "paid in full." The original purchase contract with my name, and only my name printed clearly across it. I didn't feel angry as I laid them out. I felt calm. Calm in a way I hadn't felt in years. Because for once, I wasn't trying to be understood. I was preparing to be secure. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing. Not my son, not my daughter-in-law. Silence had taught me something important already. When people believe they are entitled to something, information becomes a weapon against you. So I said nothing. I made appointments. I asked careful questions. I listened more than I spoke. I reviewed my will, line by line, not with bitterness, but with clarity. I removed assumptions. I erased vague language. I made ownership explicit. This house would not become ours through proximity, marriage, or pressure. It would remain mine until I decided otherwise, and that decision would be written, signed, and protected. At the same time, I began withdrawing in ways that felt almost invisible at first. I stopped referring to the house as home when speaking to them. I stopped offering it as a shared space. I stopped allowing decisions to be made in my absence. When my daughter-in-law suggested rearranging the living room again, I said calmly that I preferred it the way it was. When she spoke about future plans that involved the house, I didn't disagree. I simply didn't engage. My refusal to participate unsettled her more than any argument ever could have. She started watching me closely, trying to understand what had shifted. She could feel it. Something had closed quietly, without announcement. My son noticed too, though he couldn't name it. He asked if everything was okay. I told him the truth, but not the version he expected. I said I was thinking about my future. I said I was making plans. I said I wanted clarity. Those words scared him more than anger would have, because clarity leaves no room for negotiation. He didn't argue. He didn't push. He simply grew quieter, as if he sensed that the role he had relied on me to play was ending. There was no drama in those days, just distance, boundaries forming without explanation, a gradual understanding that access was no longer automatic. I wasn't taking anything away. I was just no longer offering myself as something that could be claimed. And in that space, I felt something unfamiliar but steady take root. Safety. Not emotional safety dependent on other people's choices, but legal, practical, undeniable safety, the kind that doesn't require permission. At night, I walked through the house slowly, touching the walls I had paid for, the floors I had scrubbed, the doors I had locked and unlocked for decades. I wasn't saying goodbye yet, but I was no longer afraid of leaving. For the first time, the house felt like what it truly was, a chapter, not an obligation. And I understood that quiet justice doesn't begin when you walk away. It begins the moment you stop allowing yourself to be erased. I didn't tell them what I was doing. That was the point. I had spent too many years explaining myself, justifying my boundaries, softening my decisions so others wouldn't feel uncomfortable. This time, I moved quietly, deliberately, and alone. I reviewed every document connected to the house, the deed, the land registry, the mortgage records that proved it had been paid off years ago with my own money. My name stood there clearly, unshared, unquestionable. The house was never ours. It had always been mine. I met with a lawyer without telling anyone, sat across from a woman who spoke plainly and didn't ask me to apologize for protecting myself. Together, we drafted a will that left no room for interpretation, ownership clarified, access defined, no assumptions allowed. I felt calmer with every signature, not because I was taking something away, but because I was finally putting things where they belonged. I didn't announce the changes. I didn't call a family meeting. I didn't demand understanding. I simply stopped allowing the house to be treated like a shared resource. No more casual invitations made on my behalf. No more talk of renovations that didn't include me. No more "we should do this" conversations spoken over my head in my own living room. When my daughter-in-law mentioned rearranging furniture again, I said evenly that it wouldn't be happening. When she talked about long-term plans, I reminded her, calmly, that she and my son had their own lives to build elsewhere. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I didn't explain further. I just stood where I belonged. That's when the shift became visible. She started watching her words more carefully. My son hesitated before speaking, as if suddenly unsure which side of the line he was standing on. The house felt different, not colder, but clearer. For the first time, I wasn't shrinking to make room for someone else's certainty. I wasn't pretending not to notice how often my needs had been edited out of the conversation. I wasn't waiting to be chosen in my own home. Preparing to leave didn't feel like defeat. It felt like relief. I began looking for a place that suited the life I wanted now, not the role I had been trapped in. Somewhere smaller, quieter, mine. I packed slowly, thoughtfully, choosing what to take and what to leave behind. Each item felt lighter once I stopped associating it with obligation. I wasn't running away. I was stepping forward. They sensed it before I said anything. People always do when control slips through their fingers. My daughter-in-law grew nervous, asking questions that weren't really questions. My son asked if I was okay, in the tone people use when they're afraid of what comes next. I told him the truth, without drama. I was fine. Better than fine. I was finally taking care of myself. He didn't know how to respond to that. He had grown up believing I would always bend, always adapt, always stay. But I didn't stay. I chose peace over proximity, clarity over comfort, self-respect over silence. I didn't fight her. I didn't humiliate anyone. I didn't need revenge. I protected myself, and that was enough. The house remained mine on paper and in truth, but it no longer held the weight of expectation. I walked away knowing that boundaries don't require permission and dignity doesn't need applause. As I closed the door for the last time, I felt something settle into place. Not anger, not sadness, but certainty. I had done what I needed to do. Quietly, legally, completely. And for the first time in a long time, I wasn't leaving something behind. I was choosing myself. Healing didn't arrive the way pain did. There was no single moment, No dramatic realization, no sharp turn where everything suddenly felt better. Healing came quietly, almost invisibly, woven into ordinary days that no longer required explanation. The first thing that changed was the air. The space around me felt different once I stopped living under observation. No one questioned how I spent my mornings. No one evaluated my decisions. No one measured my value by how useful I was to them. For the first time in a long while, I noticed how exhausting it had been to always be watched. I moved into a place that belonged only to me. Not large, not impressive, just enough. Every object inside it was chosen because I liked it, not because it might be needed by someone else. There were no extra rooms prepared just in case, no corners reserved for other people's comfort. At first, that felt strange. I would wake up and instinctively reach for my phone, expecting messages, requests, emergencies. Old habits don't disappear easily. When you've spent years anticipating other people's needs, silence can feel like a warning. But the phone stayed quiet, and nothing bad happened. Days passed without interruption. I drank my coffee slowly, sitting near the window, watching light move across the floor. I didn't rush. There was nowhere I needed to be, no role waiting for me to perform. That was when I realized something important. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't announce itself or demand attention. It simply exists, waiting for you to stop fighting it. I began to notice how much of my life had been shaped by fear I never named. Fear of being difficult, fear of being ungrateful, fear of losing connection if I enforced boundaries. Now that fear had nowhere to attach itself. I wasn't being judged anymore. I wasn't being measured against expectations I never agreed to. I thought about my son, but differently than before. I no longer replayed conversations in my head, wondering what I could have said better or sooner. I didn't imagine alternate versions of events where he defended me, chose me, protected me. I had stopped waiting for him to become someone else. That didn't mean the sadness disappeared. Grief still came in waves, quiet ones. Not grief for what happened, but for what never was. The relationship I believed I had, the respect I assumed existed. But grief, when accepted, doesn't control you. It teaches you. I allowed myself to feel it without letting it pull me backward. I didn't confuse missing someone with needing them. I didn't confuse love with access. That distinction changed everything. I spent time with people who didn't need me to sacrifice myself to stay close. Conversations felt lighter, not because they were shallow, but because they were honest. I didn't have to justify my boundaries or soften my truth. No one asked me to shrink. No one expected me to absorb discomfort for the sake of harmony. That was healing too. One afternoon, standing on the balcony as the sun rose, I felt something settle inside me. Not joy, not triumph. Stability, the kind that doesn't depend on approval, the kind that stays even when no one is watching. For the first time, my life was no longer under review, and I didn't miss the audience. The strangest part of healing was realizing how quiet my life became once I stopped trying to be understood. There were no more explanations rehearsed in my head, no more justifications prepared in case someone questioned my decisions, no more tension in my chest when a phone buzzed. Silence no longer meant abandonment. It meant ownership. Ownership of my time, my space, my mornings, my thoughts. I no longer lived in anticipation of approval, because approval had stopped being a currency I needed to survive. I arranged my days the way I liked them, not the way they were most convenient for others. I woke up early, not because someone might need me, but because the light felt peaceful. I drank my coffee slowly, without scanning my phone for problems that weren't mine anymore. I chose what to eat, what to read, where to go, without asking myself how it would be perceived. That freedom felt unfamiliar at first, almost selfish, until I understood that what I used to call selfish was simply self-respect delayed for too long. There were moments when memories surfaced unexpectedly, a laugh from the past, a family photo, a habit formed over decades that no longer had a place in my life. Those moments didn't break me. They passed through me. I allowed them without chasing them, without turning them into invitations for regret. Healing didn't require erasing the past, it required not living inside it. I noticed how my body changed once I stopped carrying emotional weight that wasn't mine. I slept better. I breathed deeper. My shoulders weren't tense anymore. Peace, I learned, isn't an emotion. It's the absence of constant defense. It's what happens when you're no longer bracing for disrespect disguised as love. People sometimes ask if I feel lonely. The truth is, I feel lighter. Loneliness comes from being unseen in crowded rooms, not from being alone in a quiet space. I had felt lonelier when I was surrounded by family who only valued what I provided. Now, even in silence, I felt whole. I didn't rebuild my life to prove anything. I didn't heal to teach anyone a lesson. I healed because staying wounded was costing me more than walking away ever did. That realization changed everything. I stopped measuring my worth by how much I endured. I stopped confusing sacrifice with love. I stopped waiting for validation from people who benefited from my silence. Standing on my balcony one morning, watching the sun rise, I felt something settle into place. Not joy, not triumph, but certainty. The kind that doesn't need witnesses, the kind that doesn't ask permission. I understood that I didn't need to be chosen anymore. I had already chosen myself. For the first time, my life was no longer under review. No one was grading my patience. No one was testing my generosity. No one was deciding whether I deserved peace. I wasn't performing a role. I was simply living, and that was enough. Share your thoughts in the comments. Your experience might help someone else feel less alone. If you found this story meaningful, please give it a like. It really helps this channel reach more people who need these stories. And if you believe in boundaries, quiet justice, and choosing yourself, subscribe to the channel and stay with us. The next story is coming soon, and it may hit even closer to home.